Why is this happening? Where is it coming from? What is outrage culture all about? Why is it every time you read an article under the comments, there's just so much poison and vitriol? Hi, I'm Sarb Johal, and today's show is all about the rising tide of anger on the internet. Listen to me as I talk to Dr. Ryan Martin, who's the psychology chair at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, and we talk about this rising tide of anger on the internet. Stay tuned.
Yeah, so it started honestly about probably 10 years ago, and I got really interested because I was actually sort of an active commenter, I guess I'll say, on, things in the local newspaper website, right? That at the time, disconnected from Facebook at the time. Now I think typically integrated with Facebook, but that, most papers or most news resources had these discussion forums. And I was actually a pretty active, author in some of those. I would go check each day and I would write. And I just noticed so many different versions of anger out there. A lot of fights, a lot of just angry disputes. And I got really interested. I was already an anger researcher, and I got really interested in how that was playing itself out. Around that same time, I became familiar with these websites that I've just been calling essentially rage sites that were designed to let people just vent anonymously. And at the time, this again, you have to imagine sort of a really active social media world. These websites were getting a lot of attention. There are things like justrage.com or Not Always Right or Just Vent and things like that. And people were really just using those all the time to voice their anger and vent their anger. And so I got really interested in those and essentially thinking about how the internet and social media is changing the way we feel things and changing the way we express those feelings.
Absolutely. And I think that's what really attracted me to this work and this paper in particular, because, this paper is from 2013. So it's a wee while ago, but you state very clearly that actually at that point, we didn't really know a lot about how anger is expressed on the internet, on these rage sites, as you say, and what that would mean and how what the meaning of that would be and the impact of that. And of course, now we have this, very complex social media world, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about the present day later on in this interview. But when you were posting and commenting on these sites, what were the sorts of things that came to mind with your knowledge of the literature as an anger researcher? What were the areas that you were looking to explore?
I wanted to know more than anything what people got out of venting that way. So what did it do for them psychologically to go online and essentially write and rant this way? I was a little bit familiar with actually writing as a form of treatment for anger. And so the idea that you would kind of write about your feelings has long been used in various ways related to treating emotional problems. But that's very different, right? That's a different process than just venting for venting's sake. There's a difference between I want to write to better understand where I'm coming from and why I'm feeling this way. That's different than saying, I just need to let the world know how mad I am. And so I really wanted to know, what is it people were getting out of this? Because sometimes it was about an argument, so they were trying to actually change someone's mind. But sometimes that wasn't the goal. The goal was just to go let people know anonymously how mad you were. And I wanted to know why.
And it's interesting, isn't it? It relates to this idea, as you talk about, this old idea of catharsis, this idea that by venting, by giving voice to this feeling of anger, somehow it helps us to move on, makes us feel better. And I guess one of the things that you make a point of in your literature review is that, yeah, that might be true in the short term, but long term, that doesn't look true.
Yep, we've known for actually quite some time that when it comes to anger, catharsis is simply not the way, right? In fact, we even refer to it as the catharsis myth. This idea that venting is good for you when it comes to anger. It's sort of rooted in this idea that we're like these human pressure cookers, and we, have to let go of our anger or else we'll explode, right? We need to release a little bit or we'll explode. And that's just not the way we work. What we see is that the more often we do that, the more often we're inclined to do that. And so when we, because it feels good, we're rewarded for it. And then we just continue down that road.
Yeah, and there are different ways that perhaps people are rewarded for venting their anger, and we'll come on to that, I think, when we discuss what it is that you found. But maybe we can move on to the paper. You did a couple of different studies here, so maybe you can talk a little bit about study one. What were you trying to find out, and where did you recruit your people from? I'm curious about the story there.
Yeah, so the recruitment was the difficult part. Basically, what we wanted to do is for the first part of this study was survey the actual people who go visit those websites, not just the people who rant on them, but the people who go there and read them as well, and just read the rants. And what we found, and I guess I'll talk a little bit about the recruiting piece, but what we did is we identified 4 very popular rant sites or rage sites, and we actually reached out to the administrators of those sites to ask for help recruiting people. In some cases, they were willing to do that. In other cases, they were not. We posted the link there as you could post anything anonymously on those sites. So we would post the link there and ask people to participate and that sort of thing. In some cases, they used it, the administrators actually included it as an ad, like a banner ad up on the top. Hey, take this survey. People were able to get, they were entered into a drawing for a gift card we had a couple of options for them. And so that's how we recruited participants. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that one of the limitations of the study is we did not have a huge number of participants. People were venting anonymously for a reason. And so we didn't have a lot of people who were willing to take time and talk about this. Or take the survey, I should say.
Yeah, we'll maybe come back to that issue of anonymity and how this plays into this later on. So, but yes, continue. Tell us about study one.
So study one really just asked them a handful of questions about, why they're there, either why they're reading or why they are venting. And interestingly, the reason why people go there to read the rants is just purely for entertainment. They think they're funny. They think they're interesting. They aren't there really to learn much, but they just like going there for that reason. When it comes to why people vent, one of the things that I think was the most interesting finding is that we ask people in an open-ended question how they feel after they do this. What is it like for you after you do this? And what they said, in fact, 100% of the time was, I feel relaxed, I feel calm, I feel rested. And that was surprising to me. Typically, you don't necessarily think that that's what you get from this. When we do other forms of catharsis, it's like punching your pillow and things like that. People don't necessarily feel rested afterwards, right? They feel more keyed up. And so that was a little bit surprising to me that they felt this way. But it does speak to that reward that they get, right? I get it off my chest. I let the world know how mad I am, and then I feel calm and relaxed. I should add, too, that a lot of people indicated wishing they had someone else to talk to. And so I think in some ways this audience felt relatively lonely, that one of their problems is they just felt like they didn't have anyone they could talk to about this.
I mean, yeah, that feeling of relaxation and calmness, again, was something I found very difficult to relate to. Most familiar for me is the feeling of agitation that arises. But you make the interesting point there, and we may come back to that again, is this the wanting other people to talk to, but also the benefit of reading other people's rants. 50%, I think, said that they identified a sense of community as well as a benefit of being on this site.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And this is one where you really need to take a moment and think about kind of a pre-complicated social media world like we have now. Because part of what you got from some of these sites, depending on which one, is, they had usernames. They were able to go in and there was this sense of community where people would kind of talk about each other, and they knew each other, even the people they didn't like. And they would say, oh, well, so-and-so is always so vulgar, or so-and-so is, always has such interesting posts and things like that. And so there was this kind of sense of community that they got from being part of this group, especially those groups where they had like usernames that showed up.
There's also a little bit of a darker side that's emerging there as well. One of the reasons participants gave was enjoying other people's misery as well as understanding their own problems.
Yep. Yeah, that was another reason people gave, is that it wasn't uncommon for people to say, yeah, I went there because I wanted to see, that other people's lives were as bad or worse than mine. And so they would describe that as one of their rationales for spending time there.
So one of the things that you looked at was looking at the characteristics of the people that you managed to persuade into entering into this study, and how different they might be from people in the general population. And you picked up some interesting stuff around their propensity to express anger. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so what we did is we had them take a couple of anger questionnaires, and these are anger questionnaires that we have data from the general population on, so we can make some comparisons between them and the regular population who's taking these questionnaires. And what we found is that typically, on average, ranters were angrier than the general population. In fact, they were angrier even than, or that they met the threshold for people who likely have anger problems based on these questionnaires that they took. And then we also found that they tended to express their anger in more maladaptive ways. So, there are particularly negative ways of expressing your anger, outwardly yelling, screaming, that kind of thing. Actually, suppressing anger can also be a problem, and so internalizing it. And what we found is that they were more likely to have expressed their anger in those negative, maladaptive ways.
I mean, this calls into all sorts of different things for me in terms of psychological targeting of messages and conversion of people who have a profile like this into behaving in particular ways. And I guess we've got a show coming up in a wee while that's going to be discussing that. We'll come back to that. Tell us about study 2, because this is a different group of people with a different set of tasks that you're asking them to do, right?
Yeah, so we brought in a group of college students, and we had them actually kind of go through the experience that someone would go through if they went to that website. They read a couple of rants, and then they got to write their own. And then they reported their mood kind of after writing their own rants. And so we gave them a few minutes to just write whatever they wanted to, and then we recorded their mood. And really, what we found is that we didn't have the same sort of response from our participants than what you saw from the participants we found on the websites. The participants in the second study, they actually they didn't seem to feel calm and relaxed after they ranted. They actually felt angrier. And actually, the other thing that happened is a lot of them got sad through this process. They didn't like reading some of those posts. Whether it was because of the tone, whether it was just because they were kind of embarrassed for the people there. So really, in some ways, it speaks to a very specific population that goes and enjoys reading some of the posts on that website.
It's interesting, isn't it? I've noticed over the last few years, more and more kind of mainstream organizations, news organizations have turned off the comment feature on their websites. And I wonder whether it's to kind of, it's partly maybe to protect their advertising revenue, because it's really off-putting, I think, for the majority of people to be exposed to that.
Right. Yeah, I think and I've noticed that with, I've noticed that as well, a lot of, the turning off of comments in news sources, but other places as well. And I think that, I do think it is a turnoff for people. And I think actually, we're starting to see some evidence that a lot of young people are gravitating more towards things like Snapchat versus Twitter. And I think some of that is probably driven by the hostility that is alive and well on a place like Twitter. That you don't necessarily see that same sort of hostility and that same sort of environment in Snapchat, or at least we don't think we do. Snapchat's much harder to research than some of these other things because it's not as public. But I wonder if that hostility is driving people away from some of those media sites.
Sure. So again, some of the things that came up in this second study was that you asked people whether they would go back to this experience, go back, revisit a website like this. And what were the sorts of things that people were saying?
Most did not want to. Most were pretty happy to not have to go there again. Yeah. And the ones who did they were the ones who ended up, for whatever reason, they just found it entertaining. So they were the ones who were sort of most similar to the audience that we surveyed as far as that goes. But yeah, most people didn't want to go back to that website.
So as I was reading your paper, I guess three things kind of stood out for me. One was this kind of strange sense of community for some people that these sorts of sites served to fulfill a need somehow. The idea of this being an outlet for some people, which was rewarding for them. But then there was this thing that came up in both: entertainment. And I'm wondering what you make of that. What do we know about how expressing anger or seeing anger written down and engaging with that? How do we explain that?
Yeah, it's actually a great question. It's a great research question that I can only at this point speculate on as far as what the answers are. But because you're right, we do see people being very interested in anger, in viewing it or witnessing or seeing it. And you can find that on YouTube, right? Whenever people sort of tape these or record these angry interactions they have, those tend to be very popular on YouTube. In fact, you even see them going, viral in their own way in other places where, someone just happens to catch a person have an outburst at the mall. And then and then it gets watched millions of times. And so I think that for whatever reason, watching other people lose control is the kind of thing that seems to interest us. We have this fascination with it. And I think that extends, if you think about, the popularity I shouldn't say the popularity, but you think about the US president, Donald Trump, and the way in which his Twitter activity, his Twitter hostility, I should say, has really captivated people on both sides. They really are fascinated by it in a way they probably shouldn't be. But you do see a lot of fascination with that, and it's a little bit like looking at a car accident sometimes. This idea that I want to watch people behave badly.
And I'm just thinking, as you were talking, about how does anonymity kind of map onto this? Because as well as watching people behaving badly, and I guess the idea that's going through in my mind is that the anonymity that people have now, or can easily attain, gives them also permission to behave badly, as well as watching people behaving badly.
Yeah, that was actually, and I'll be honest, I don't remember if it was that study or a different one, but in one of the studies I have done, about 50% of participants said that they wouldn't behave any differently if it weren't anonymous. And I don't believe that for a second. I think we've got lots of evidence that says online anonymity exacerbates anger and aggression and hostility. That in some ways that's sort of a license to do that. I mean, it's part of what we see. I mean, I think sometimes I think of the online environment as a little bit similar to an offline mob, right? And that we know that when people aren't when it feels like they're anonymous, whether they are or not, they behave differently than they otherwise would, right? And it's why sometimes in big groups, people say and do things that they wouldn't do if they were just standing there on their own. And I think that it's very clear that the online environment, the anonymity offered by the online environment, even if it's just the perception of anonymity, really exacerbates the kind of hostility and aggression we see.
So, Ryan, have you taken this forward? This research was published in 2013, and you're an anger researcher. How have you taken forward or further explored these ideas on the internet as we see it today and the various different environments that people can view and interact and create content related to this anger? I'm actually in the process of doing some of that follow-up research, and I've collected some data on Twitter and other sorts of sources to get a feel for what it is or why people express their anger the way they do. What we see is that a lot of people just willingly go to, and Twitter in particular was one of the more recent studies, and this is unpublished raw data at this point, but about half of Twitter users say they tweet often as a way of dealing with anger. That's one of the things they do, and so these are participants who actually know, I use Twitter that way intentionally. A lot of them are hoping that the person that they're venting about will read it, and so they are interested in that for that reason. And a lot of people know these numbers are smaller, but when you think about that, one of the things I've been really interested in is, so the backstory here is that we have this questionnaire that we've been using for a long time called the Anger Consequences Questionnaire. But the Anger Consequences Questionnaire was designed well before social media was a thing. And so what I'm curious about is how, what some of the new consequences are. And what we hear is that people, I've got 3% of people say they've lost a friend because of things they've tweeted. We've got participants, 9% said in the last month that they've gotten in arguments that they later regretted. Even sending email they later regretted, because the online environment isn't just social media. Email, texting, things like that are also possible. And so I think that we see that there's lots of, or what some of what our findings really include this idea that people are having some pretty serious consequences because of the way they are expressing their anger. And that shouldn't be too surprising to us in the sense that this is a relatively new environment, and people, haven't been well trained for it. And I think that's part of what's going on, is that the norms aren't there, and people they haven't necessarily developed the capacity for impulse control in that environment. And so I think all of those things are kind of playing themselves out. That's a very interesting point around managing impulse control and how we get taught to do that and these immediately present mechanisms which make it so easy for us to express them.
Right.
So you've kind of like started going into my final kind of section here, Ryan, but who should care about this research that you're doing, this paper, and where you're going with this, and this idea of anger on the internet, and what's the point? What should we be doing with this?
I think, what I would say is, as far as who should care is, and I'm going to expand this. I mean, I'm mostly talking about anger, but what I say about anger could be true about, frankly, any emotion. But I think all human beings who interact, who are involved in social media in any way should care. I think actually social media and the internet have fundamentally changed the way human beings experience and express emotions. This morning, first thing I did when I got up, I set my coffee to start making my coffee, and then I grabbed my phone and started just flipping through Facebook. And during that time, I saw all of these different comments or posts from friends, and I contrast that with 10 years ago. And I wouldn't have had access to any of that information. And so in that information, I might learn that a friend is sick. I may learn that a friend is getting divorced. I may learn that a family member feels very differently than me about politics, et cetera. I've got all this different information that I didn't have before. And that's all information that I can react to emotionally. And so I don't know what I used to do while I waited for my coffee to be made, but it wasn't learn that stuff about people. And now I'm having all these emotions first thing in the morning that I probably wouldn't have had a while ago. And so it fundamentally changes things from that perspective, but then it also changes how we can respond. And I mean, it changes the language of our responses too, with the way in which people communicate now with GIFs and the way that we communicate with emoticons and all these things. And so we've got this new language for how we express our emotions. And then we obviously have the new venue, right? I can, post online, I can send emails, I can send texts, I can do all of these things that I couldn't do before. And that, again, I think really changes the way we communicate and the way we feel things.
And just as you were speaking there, I was thinking about your Facebook experience and how common that will be for many people who are listening to this. And I was wondering about the carryover impact of that kind of like emotional stimuli, of that dose that you have whilst you're waiting for your coffee. Do we know about the sort of like the lasting impact and consequences? How long does that last? How does it set people up to receive further stimuli during the day, or close them off? Actually, they're like, that's too much, I'm not going to do that anymore, or predispose them. All of these things around having that experience that we, like you say, didn't have a decade ago. It's a short amount of time. Yeah,
and I don't think we have any quantitative data to say that there is a carryover effect, but I think that despite that, we know that there must be a carryover effect. One of the things we talk about when we think about the typical reason why people get angry, so much of it has to do with the state they are in before they are provoked, right? Whether or not, and we all know this, right? You're more likely to get angry if you're already tired or hungry or running late for something or hot or whatever. And so, if you already are sort of queued up to be angry based on all of this stuff you've been reading in the news or all this stuff you've been reading on Facebook or whatever, that you're going to be more likely to get angry from when provoked later on. And so we must assume that, or we have every reason to assume that there is some sort of carryover effect. What we don't know is how long it lasts or how significant the effect is.
Wouldn't it be great if we get some kind of like real-time content analysis of people's consumption of media and then real-time emotional tracking, or even blood pressure tracking, as they go through the day? That would be fantastic.
Absolutely. One thing I always want to convey to people is when I talk about anger is that we have a tendency to think of anger as always bad, as always problematic. And anger, and it's because we notice it most when it gets in the way. But anger is actually a fundamentally valuable emotion. It has this, evolutionary, what developed in us because it solves some of evolutionarily adaptive problems, right? It alerts us to injustice. It energizes us to confront injustice. And so I think it'd be a shame if people walked away from this show or any other discussion of anger thinking of it as primarily bad. I think it's primarily good, but the key is, and this is what's really relevant to your show, is the key is how we express it. What do we do with it? There's all sorts of healthy ways to deal with anger. There's actually even all sorts of healthy ways to deal with anger online, right? I can write my congressperson. I can communicate in like a positive, pro-social, assertive way instead of, having a fit or having a tantrum.
Hey, thanks for watching today. Don't forget to like if you found this helpful or interesting and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell notification so that you don't miss any more of my new videos. Thanks again for watching and see ya.